So it's a great honor to welcome you all, Seyla Benhabib, James Hunter, Ivan Krastev, and Michael Sandel, to this panel to explore the American politics. And we are happy to do that with some of the most distinguished thinkers in the fields of political sciences, political philosophy, social theory, ethics, international politics. We are deeply grateful to you for your time and presence today. Why our title? I would say we want, with you, reflect on the outcome of the American elections, an outcome that forces us to look at the accumulation of resentment against the liberal elites, a resentment which is arising, of course, first of all, from economic malaise, social frustration, and fear. It has been well written that resentment sends bad people to power, and it can undermine democracy, something which is true for Europe as well. So let us try to understand why this happens. Why does malaise breed trust in leaders who despise women's rights, minorities' rights culture, leaders who complain about excessive focus on sexual freedom or excessive commitment against racism, all of which are dismissed with disparaging levels of political correctness or wokeness. We are interested in this trajectory. How can it happen that we look at this passage from anger over low wages and inflation to the rejection of the liberal culture? How can that happen? Can this trend be corrected? Do we need to walk back from culture wars, as has been suggested, for example, by Daron Acemoglu, and others have also proposed that? Is this a way to reverse? To reverse the elitist and unpopular image of the liberal culture and enter into a friendlier dialogue with traditions, even when it is conflicting with individual rights? Should we support or at least open a conversation with a post-liberal vision of politics? So how and how far? These are the questions we have on the table, Jonathan. And I would like, on that, leave you the microphone to introduce our speakers.
Thank you very much. Good day, good morning, good afternoon to all. I'd just like to add my welcome to Giancarlo's from Reset Dialogues US. I'd like to express our collective gratitude to Giancarlo Bozzetti himself for convening us together with Nina Furstenberg. He established Reset Dialogues on Civilizations more than 20 years ago. And the impetus for this international association of scholars and intellectuals from around the United States, Europe, Turkey, the Arab world, beyond, remains extraordinarily relevant. Research work has brought people together year after year to discuss democracy, pluralism, religious and political liberties, and that remains critical, just as it was during earlier eras, from the hope-filled opening of Turkish politics and the Arab Spring, through the darker moments of democratic backsliding and outright war that we have experienced in these last 2 decades. Reset has supported these critical conversations with annual seminars around the US, Italy, and the Mediterranean, and throughout the year. So, as Giancarlo mentioned, we are extraordinarily fortunate to have 4 extremely esteemed public intellectuals with us here to discuss our theme. And first up will be James Davison Hunter. I will ask each of them to speak for just around 8 to 10 minutes and I'll introduce them in turn. So first, James Davison Hunter is the LaBrosse Levinson Distinguished Professor of Religion, Culture, and Social Theory at the University of Virginia, where he has been a faculty member since 1983, and he has long served as the UVA's Director of Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. The list of Professor Hunter's publications is extremely impressive. It includes Evangelicalism, the Coming Generation, which the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion honored with its Distinguished Book Award. It also includes Articles of Faith, Articles of Peace, for which he was given the Gustavus Myers Award for the study of human rights. And most recently, Democracy and Solidarity on the Cultural Roots of America's Political Crisis, which Yale University Press published this year. He has served on the National Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and he is a previous recipient of the Weber Prize for Scholarly Letters. We are very lucky to count him among our speakers here today. And so, James, I would like to hand the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Giancarlo, for the invitation. And thank all of you for the opportunity to dialogue together. I'm a historical and cultural sociologist. And for better or for worse, I introduced the concept of culture wars over 30 years ago in a book by that name, Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America. And very briefly, it came out of observations in which I was seeing a change take place through most of the 20th century. The categories of left and right and most of the political conflict that emanated from that division were rooted in the cultural logics of political economy. But it was about the wealthy versus the poor. It was about the working class and labor unions against corporate interests. And it seemed to me by the end of the 1970s into the 1980s, a shift was taking place in which political economy simply wasn't accounting for some of the deepest divisions in our public life and political life. So I wrote a book, borrowed the concept from Bismarck and called it Culture Wars. Now, over 30 years later, I've written, I think, what I hope is the bookend to that project in this new book called Democracy and Solidarity. And basically, I take a different approach from so many who are writing on the crisis of democracy. If we take politicians, political activists, journalists, and the most impassioned citizens as our guide, we'll tend to see the problems we face in contemporary political life as rooted in the corruption or the bad decisions or flawed ideology of a particular leader or a particular party. Partisans of all stripes see things this way. The leaders and the parties of the opposition are nearly always portrayed as beyond the pale, a threat to decency, civility, justice, fairness. Indeed, in our case, a threat to America. The news media reinforce this polarization when they report on the ups and downs of political fortune by this candidate or that, this party or that, on this issue or that. For most activists, commentators, and citizens, the crisis of democracy is not a common crisis, but one caused by the other side. The question of how to restore democracy then comes down to mobilizing our political will in a new election or new referendum, voting the wrong party out and the right party in. It's as simple as that. But even when the assessments go deeper than this, observers tend to locate the problems with democracy within politics itself. For example, within the weakening of America's voting system through voter suppression, or within the primary system and the corruptions of the Electoral College. The key here is that whatever the problems are that we face, they are in the end fixable. And what all the remedies share in common is the belief that any remedy comes down to a matter of political will and smart public policy. The general sense is that if we are just a little bit more clever or try just a little bit harder by mobilizing our individual and collective political resolve, we can rebuild the social fabric that gives life to democracy. The story I would tell revolves around the cultural resources that have funded liberal democracy and how, through conflict, these sources have evolved over the course of 2.5 centuries. I argue that the specific configuration of cultural sources that underwrote American democracy, what I call America's hybrid enlightenment, came together to provide an ethical vision for the reconstitution of public life. It not only made certain ideas and ideals intelligible, but in the process provided sources for solidarity or cohesion that, by virtue of their opacity, could contain its many internal disagreements. The critical question is solidarity on what terms? It's an important question because solidarity, even one that depends upon opacity, always has limits. That's to say, solidarity always is set within boundaries that define a line between inclusion and exclusion. What makes the story historically and ethically compelling is the way in which those sources, and thus the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion, have been contested over many generations. That contestation is an ineradicable feature of liberal democracy in America, and not least because of fundamental contradictions present within the hybrid enlightenment at the very start, namely the promise of freedom and equality and universal justice, and yet the denial of those goods to large swaths of the American population. The hope of a vibrant political solidarity implied in America's hybrid enlightenment was always set against contradictions intrinsic within itself, contradictions that have guaranteed and continue to guarantee tension, conflict, and at times violence. The story I tell is how those contradictions within America's hybrid enlightenment have been repeatedly worked through. The process of working through, and I use the concept of carbon from those contradictions certainly and often dramatically altered the character of the hybrid enlightenment over the years, but invariably in ways that have remained recognizable to successive generations, at least until the present, when those efforts are being abandoned by leading factions of the right and the left. But that's not quite the whole story either, for solidarity is not just about the will to come together to do the work of democratic politics. It's also about the cultural preconditions and normative sources that make that coming together possible in the first place. Those sources, it would seem, have largely unraveled. I bring that story to a conclusion by calling into relief the complex and rather dark place to which American political culture has brought us. The sources of solidarity drawn from America's hybrid enlightenment have partly disappeared from shared memory and practice, but they also have partly evolved into deformations of their highest and best ideals. More troubling still, they have been replaced by an alternative and frankly nihilistic cultural logic, one that is ironically shared across our political and partisan divisions, that not only renders democratic solidarity impossible, but creates the conditions in which the authoritarian impulse becomes impossible to restrain. Simply put, the authoritarian impulse becomes manifest in the attempt to address the absence of solidarity. If solidarity cannot be generated organically, it will be imposed coercively. Now, I'd like to make two very quick points, and I'll bring my comments to a close. There's a tendency to focus on the observable elements of culture, and so this first comment is about culture itself. So we tend to focus on the observable elements of culture, such as the values and beliefs and folklore and folkways of people, and perhaps their cultural institutions. Of even greater significance, in my view, or what I would call the deep structures of culture, by which I mean the tacit and latent frameworks of meaning embedded within the structures of social life. These are the cultural antecedents of political life, and it's from these resources, of these tacit assumptions and latent frameworks of meaning, that liberal democracy has been able to change and yet maintain a thread of continuity. This is partly why I use the word solidarity as opposed to consensus or unity. The word consensus suggests rational agreement, placing great store on reason and rationality to the exclusion of the affective and sociological dimensions of human experience. To be sure, that a certain degree of consensus is necessary among those who make and enforce the law and procedures for determining the law, policymakers, judges, law enforcement, and the like. Otherwise, the concept of rule of law would have no meaning. But its applicability tends to be narrow and limited primarily to those who are technically and administratively proficient in the law. Consensus in this sense may radiate outward from that space into opaque ideals that can be shared by large portions of the citizenry. But to apply the concept of rational consensus to the general public, while warranted, as a rule, it sets untenably high expectations. Instead, in this context, solidarity serves as a more useful concept by signaling that there are other things that bind us together besides our capacity to rationally agree or argue or deliberate. It further suggests a predilection toward a cohesion or concord that is capable of transcending or folding within it any particular disagreements. The power of solidarity is found in the unspoken, often vague and fuzzy resonances of shared identity, shared affections, shared challenges, and a shared destiny. And so if Americans are divided politically, it's because they are divided culturally at this level. If there is little or no common political ground today, it's because there are few, if any, common assumptions about the nature of a good society that underwrite a shared political life. If we can't find a way beyond our political stalemates, it's because we cannot find the cultural sources of common hopes or a common vocabulary for articulating those hopes in ways that transcend those impasses and lead us beyond them. Much the same, of course, can be said of the crises of democracy beyond American shores. Authoritarian tendencies have always been present in the shadows of all modern nations and have now reemerged publicly in democracies long thought to be immune from those tendencies. Scanning the range of crises, we can certainly find common themes. Given the power of globalization and its interconnectivity, how could we not? Yet there are also important differences among nations that are rooted in the irreducible particularities of history, region, and circumstance. Now to my second point, the historical point. The largest part of my argument is historical, and it begins with a sketch of the contours of the hybrid Enlightenment. Drawing as much from Calvinism as it did from classical republicanism and Lockean individualism, it was a complex and fairly thick cosmology from which a powerful and generative mythos would take shape. Yet it was also deeply contradictory. It would fuel a century of nation building, but it also deepened the contradictions by doubling down on the boundaries of exclusion, most egregiously against the Aboriginal tribes of the continent and African-born slaves, but also against Roman Catholics, Mormons, and Jews. There are clear signs, however, that we are now in a period of exhaustion. The endlessly worked through sources of the hybrid Enlightenment are depleted and no longer have traction. For some, those resources have been forgotten. For others, they have been distorted beyond recognition to serve partisan interests. And for still others, they are seen as the fundamental problem with America. No matter the case, they have unraveled as sources of solidarity. Now, that doesn't mean that all solidarity has disappeared or that everything has fallen apart. Far from it. But it's also clear that the hybrid Enlightenment, as the evolving source of much of America's solidarity, has unraveled at its deepest levels, and we have not yet seen the full consequences of that development. This leaves us with fundamental questions about the very possibility of liberal democracy in our time. If, in fact, the frameworks of meaning and interpretation and the cultural logics that defined the hybrid Enlightenment, in turn, created the conditions for the birth of liberal democracy in America, and in some debatable measure has sustained it over time, what now? What happens when the former loses its authority? Can an Enlightenment-era political institution, liberal democracy, survive and thrive in a post-Enlightenment culture? Is there anything from the hybrid Enlightenment project that remains, that's salvageable or renewable? What, if anything, can be reconstructed from this deconstructed culture? Or if, for some, salvaging the hybrid Enlightenment project is neither possible sociologically nor desirable politically or ethically, then what cultural resources will fund liberal democracy going forward? The answer to these questions are not obvious. Neither is it obvious that there are answers. We have long wanted to believe not only in the durability and stability of American democratic institutions, but also their long-term vitality. Democracy in America has survived for 2.5 centuries, meeting and mediating severe disruptions to the social order along the way. Why shouldn't it survive well into the future? Perhaps it will, but it's in no way guaranteed, and we should not assume that it will. The assumption of the enduring vitality of liberal democracy in America is challenged not only by the unraveling of the deep structures of the hybrid Enlightenment, but also by what appears to be filling the void. Underneath the polarization of a different common culture is emerging, but tragically not one that fosters unity. Rather, it's one that, by its nature, turns in on itself and destroys. It's a culture of nihilism, driven by a cultural logic of ressentiment, a narrative of injury that seeks revenge through a will to power. Its negations lead, as Reef once put it, to a nothingness that can be both radical and reactionary at the same time. As we see all around us, the challenge to a meaningful and effective governing under these conditions is difficult, if not impossible. All true on its own terms. Add to this the multiple crises of global poverty, rogue states with nuclear weapons, climate change, mass immigration, an increasingly unstable international order and the like, and the stakes are indeed high. My contention is that we are at a moment when the answers to these fundamental questions about the vitality and longevity of liberal democracy can no longer be assumed, though not because we are polarized, but because we no longer have the cultural resources to work through what divides us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this intervention, Professor Hunter. I'm grateful and will have a lot to dig into there. It's very rich. I will present next our second speaker, who is Ivan Krastev, chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia. He is also a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Mr. Krastev is among the founding members of the European Council on Foreign Relations and has been on the Global Advisory Board of the Open Society Foundation, former director of the International Commission on the Balkans, and editor-in-chief of the Bulgarian edition of Foreign Policy magazine. He has been a key voice in discussions of democratization across Europe and a member of transatlantic conversations on almost every conceivable topic related to democracy, and he has been a prolific author, most recently After Europe, which championed the European Union, won extensive praise, and received the Jean Améry Prize for European essay writing. We've been lucky to host Ivan Krastev at past events and welcome you back for this discussion. The floor is yours, Ivan.
Thank you very much. And of course, being invited to speak on the panel about the future of the American politics is really challenging, but always on a panel like this, you should have somebody who is ignorant enough to be ready to say things that people are going to disagree with. I'm not a student of the American politics, so from certain point of view, when I see American politics, I'm much more trying to relate to other type of experiences and places that I know better. And from this point of view, I'll try to be very brief and just to make 4 simple points. For foreigner, and particularly East European, that has a kind of a major political rupture in our personal biography, one of the most important things that started happening in the United States, and it was before these elections, it probably was 2020, when for the first time it was very much articulated, this was this intensive talk about the last elections. Could it be the last elections? And this was a different versions of the idea of the last elections. The last elections is going to be either, and this is basically the version on the left, that it's going to be the last elections because autocratic leader is going to be elected and he's not going to basically have elections anymore. Or the Republican version is going to be, this is going to be the last elections because after that is because of migrations and citizenship policies, governments are going to be able to elect their own people. All the story about basically undocumented voting. And I do believe this is critically important because as a result of it, the first thing that I see as a crisis of American democracy is that we're talking a lot about political community, but for many reasons, demographic, migrations, and others, suddenly the borders of the political community are not self-evident. And because they're not self-evident, in my view, one of the major messages coming from the campaign of Donald Trump was the exclusive nature of basically of democracy, and the idea is that the major border in democracy is the border between citizens and non-citizens. And very much goes on this. The second thing that in my view also has changed not only for America, but for many other places is our view of the future. And I'm going to argue that democracy is preconditioned on a certain understanding of the future. Future that is open, future that basically can be changed, future that have this positive utopian dimension, but also the short-term future, which certain problems can be solved, but other problems can be postponed. And Jonathan White, in my view, had a very good book about this, the very important role of the future as a political institution. Suddenly, for different reasons, both on the left and on the right, there was a much more apocalyptic view of the future. You start fearing the future. Future is not a project, future is projections. And because of the climate disaster on the left, young people started to see them as the last generation. Because of the demographic fears on the right, basically, many start to see them as the last Bulgarian, the last Hungarian, the last German. But as a result of it, suddenly, future comes closed. You cannot basically postpone any type of a major decisions for the future. And this closing of the future, in my view, is part of the story. And this also explains another part of the picture seen from afar of somebody who does not have American politics. I do believe that elections are important for what they represent, interest, values, but also they're very important of what they do not represent. And what they do not represent is intensity. You who care very much about certain issues, and I who do not care much, both of us has one vote. And this vote are equal. So from this point of view, non-representation of intensity was very much part of the way societies were going to be reconciled on the election night. In the new media environment, particularly as the social media and others, suddenly intensity become critical. And if you look at political parties, in a certain way, they traded consistency for intensity. Nobody's going for political programs anymore. It's very much about the intensity. It's very much about showing how important it is. And I'm saying this because I want to end up with 3 very brief points in which everybody now is focusing on the victory of Donald Trump and basically saying why people voted for him. For me, much more interesting to understand the crisis of American democracy, and particularly from the point of view in which you are interested about the cultural wars, is why the Biden project didn't work. Because in a certain way, Biden was defined as a very transformative project. And there were three important things, which in my view were very characteristics of this. It was not a project based, to be honest, on the cultural wars. It was very much about transformation, the new Roosevelt moment. It was about basically the Green Deal as a New Deal. There was a huge spending. And he had the feeling that because of COVID, people again basically has recognized the important role of the government. And my major argument is that part of the failure of the Biden project is slightly misinterpretation of the political effect of COVID. Because COVID on one side basically probably initially created this demand for government, but in a long term, in a certain way, it strengthens certain libertarian impulses. Basically, people said, I don't want to be told how to live. So politicians were in the difficult situation in which voters are telling them, I'm giving you a mandate to change the world, but don't touch my way of life. And I believe this is an important moment because many of the voters that went to Trump went there because they basically didn't like neither the long lockdowns, they didn't like also on a cultural field the way they ask how to speak and how to behave and so on. And this is very, very important part of this. The second important pillar of this kind of a Biden project was the idea of normality. And this was, we are normal, they are weird, there is a normalcy. But in a certain way, when normality is perceived much more as defending the status quo, then basically this is becoming a self-defeating strategy. And I'm saying this because while on the left, and particularly Democratic Party, it was talk about normality, the attack on the right was that what the left is doing is not abnormal, but it's unnatural. And it goes with agenda policies, it goes here and there. This idea of restoring the idea of the natural order against a certain idea of political normality. And in my view, this type of a framing work that particularly worked, by the way, with certain groups that was surprise for the Biden strategist, because when people are saying it was not the cultural politics also that failed, he went to the unions, he was doing much more trying to stress the black collar workers and so on. He went to these groups and suddenly it turned out that the educational gap is so big that the words in which the Democrats speak basically cannot translate on the experience of these people. We see also kind of a different divides on this generation. And the last thing that then, this is my last point, is that the third thing on which in a certain way Biden project was based was very much kind of the historically tested experience that external threat is going to produce a certain level of national unity. So after Russia's aggression in Ukraine, the idea that there is a war and this war is going to keep the unity of the nations, and basically Americans knows how to react to things like this, and there is a legacy of the Cold War, and there is, of course, the Roosevelt moment. And in my view, this is something new, and we see it in America, but we see it outside of America. External threat is not producing national unity anymore. In a democratic societies, even when both sides are recognizing the threat like real, for example, Poland is a great example, you're going to see both government and the opposition believing that the threat is real, but this is not pushing for more cooperation. And I do believe that this is a kind of a new situation. And I don't know what it tells us about the future of American politics. But what I see on these elections is the end of the American exceptionalism. Suddenly, many of the things that I see in America, I have been seeing in countries very far away from America and very different in their history to America. So probably talking about the crisis of liberal democracies, this is something much more general than basically the normal talk about the crisis of democratization or the crisis particularly of a certain American political cycle. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for these remarks, which provide an interesting contrast and start to introduce some context for the American case. I really appreciate that. Next up comes Seyla Benhabib, who has been a part of Reset Dialogues on Civilizations Network for over 20 years. She's a founding member, really, of the advisory committee and a frequent speaker at Reset events. She served as the intellectual inspiration for our Istanbul seminars for nearly a decade. Seyla Benhabib is a longtime faculty member at Yale University, where she has been the Eugene Meyer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy. She also serves as a senior research scholar at Columbia Law School. She is a renowned scholar and thinker, and she's been awarded, among many other accolades, the Ernst Bloch Prize in 2012, the Identity Foundation and the University of Cologne's Meister Eckhart Prize, and just this year, the Theodor Adorno Prize from the city of Frankfurt. Professor Benhabib has published widely. Her new book, At the Margins of the Modern State, Critical Theory and Law, will appear next year. She has been a longtime member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a corresponding fellow of the British Academy of Humanities and Social Sciences. Seyla, we are so pleased to have the chance to hear from you today. Welcome back, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan, for these very kind words. Indeed, it's a pleasure to be back in Reset Dialogues after a hiatus of about 5 years or so. I always enjoy listening to Ivan Krastev, and I learned a lot from James Hunter's arresting concept of hybrid enlightenment. I should say that I was going to label my comments partially the end of American political exceptionalism, but Ivan already anticipated this. But I want to start talking about the relationship of democracy and demography. As many of you know, in the last 2 decades, I have done a lot of work both at the normative and at the empirical level on the question of migration and the boundaries of the demos, which is an issue that echoes throughout democracies. I want to begin by reminding us that Donald Trump challenged Barack Obama's presidency around the question of Obama's birthright, right? For many, many years, Trump tried to other Barack Obama. And so we could already see the beginning there of articulating a deep-seated fear that sometimes is referred to as the majority-minority democracy, namely that the United States may indeed become not only a multi-ethnic democracy, which it is, but also a multi-racial democracy. So I do believe that Trump's attempts to excavate these fears about who are we and the boundaries of the demos go back quite some time, and they fell on receptive ears. Now, I want to do something a little maybe unusual in conversations when we talk about immigration. And let me just give you a few numbers, which will surprise me. But the immigration numbers do not correspond to the reality of the conversation about immigration in many, many parts of the world. It is only 3.6% of the population of the world, 7.8 billion, whatever, that have been migrants that is living in countries other than the country of their birth in 2020. That is 281 million people. This is not a huge number. Then why is there such an anxious discourse about migration? And the other part of it is actually the intensification of worldwide movements across borders. And this is indeed part of the era of neoliberal financial globalization, call it whatever you wish. What has happened in the last 50 years everywhere in the world, not just in the United States, is an intensification of the movement of peoples, and along with that, the inability to deal with it, both at the administrative and at the level of political culture. And maybe here I'm converging with some of the things that James said as well. Just this morning, if you read your New York Times, there are some new figures about migrants numbers in the United States. The article in general made the argument that these last years have seen the most increase in the American population of the rate of migrants since the 1850s. Today, in fact, 14.3% of the American population consists of migrants understood as people who are living in countries other than that of their birth. Now, language here can be politically very tricky and very challenging. Migrants, which migrants? Those Ukrainians, Cubans, or Haitians admitted under a temporary protected status, which is a legal category in American migration policy, or those people who also have spatial status because they served with the forces, American forces in Iraq or Afghanistan, okay? The United States, as a global power, has relationships and obligations to nations and people in the world that get caught, if you wish, in its own net of foreign policy. So migration is such a complicated issue, both normatively and empirically, because it signifies something about the standpoint of the United States as a world power. So there is both the commonality of the challenge of migration, and there is the American exceptional aspect of migration, which corresponds to its being a global force. America has, for example, obligations to people who acted as translators for it during the Afghanistan war. Even in the community in Massachusetts, in the Berkshires, where I spend a lot of time, there are Afghani refugees now that are coming to an old deindustrialized city called Pittsfield. Okay, what does all this lead to? There is tremendous public obfuscation about the empirics of migration in the first place. And what has happened is that, to recall a phrase that Zygmunt Bauman used in one of our seminars, strangers become dangers. The normal American does not know who is an undocumented migrant, who has been stuck in immigration court, who has had her asylum application turned down. The ordinary American does not know this. But what they do know and what they are told is that the illegals are invading our country, challenging our country. I mean, the language is just absolutely appalling. And, you know, in some ways, incredible. However, is there a grain of truth in the feeling that American citizens now seem to have? They seem to agree to Trump's deportation policy, at least according to some of the news that I'm reading. Why would an American citizen that has always prided herself in this country being a country of immigrants, why is this agreement emerging, which is really distressful? Because the burden of migration is always local and regional, but decisions about national borders are made at the federal level in this country as well. So there are regional imbalances between Arizona, New York, Florida, California, in terms of the level of migration burden. There is a burden that people are feeling. I think it would be foolish on the left to deny that resources necessary to absorb migration are not there. But there is something deeper. And this goes back to a point that Ivan made. I think there is a failure of nerve about the meaning of American citizenship. And I also believe that this is a theme that Michael has taken up in some of his writings. The failure of nerve is that this country no longer seems to have the political culture to socialize the stranger in its own constitutional ideals. Constitutional patriotism, which Jürgen Habermas thought was the singular achievement of American constitutional culture, is disappearing. And it may be disappearing for all the reasons that have been named: ressentiment, nihilism, together with the effects of deindustrialization, neoliberal globalization. And that's why we have a regressive move now to birthright citizenship. It's not the first time that birthright citizenship has been discussed. Peter Schuck and Roger Smith, political theorists, international political law, have raised the question about birthright citizenship. But when birthright citizenship is challenged, there is a confusion about how citizenship should be granted on the one hand, and the socialization or the acculturation of the citizen, which is something that we should take seriously. And so in that sense, I see a failure of nerve in the recourse back to this language of birthright citizenship, which makes it seem as if the kind of ethno-national logic is going to solve our problems. It's not. It's going to make millions of people very miserable. We are going to see American soldiers with their bayonets moving migrants across the border. And I hope many Americans will get outraged at seeing these images and will not accept it. Now, one last point. Why is there the failure of nerve about American citizenship? Part of it is, and here I agree with Michael, it's the question of what money can't buy, right? Money cannot buy everything. And the neoliberal revolution, or whatever now maybe reaching its end, the neoliberal revolution of our times has converted everything either into a service or a monetary value. I mean, if we can distinguish the market from the forum, the exchange of ideas, and from the state, the exercise of public power, what we have in the last 30, 40 years is that the paradigm of the market has come to dominate the forum since the Citizens United decision in the Supreme Court. And now what we have is the transformation, or the wish to transform the state into the biggest corporation of all. I mean, if you do look at Donald Trump's cabinet appointments and the so-called DOGE program, what is the program? The program is to treat the federal government as if it were a corporation from which you can eliminate waste. And in some cases, what American capitalism has done, hedge funders and so on, they buy old corporations and they divide them into various parts and resell them. So this is a moment indeed that is decisive. So much is happening, but also the transformation of public power into private domination, which may result from the Project 2025, the DOGE plan, whether it's a consequence of American libertarianism or whether it is a consequence of a new stage in the development of neoliberal capitalism that is really turning the state, as you know, Friedrich Engels would have said, into the monopoly power of the bourgeoisie. That remains to be seen. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Seyla, for these remarks and for introducing these new questions about the demographic boundaries of American democracy. Our last speaker is Michael Sandel. He is one of America's foremost public intellectuals. He has been effectively intervening in and shaping public debate in the United States and around the world for decades. He is a scholar and teacher of political philosophy at Harvard and an internationally renowned speaker and writer. More generally, he has written widely on ethics, markets, and justice. I'd like to draw attention to a new edition of his celebrated 1996 work, Democracy's Discontent, which appeared recently and which will form the inspiration for a future Reset seminar. Professor Sandel has spoken at some of the world's most celebrated sites, including London's St. Paul's Cathedral and the Sydney Opera House in Australia, and I would add the Reset Dialogues Venice seminars at the Fondazione Cini. Professor Sandel has contributed to the President's Council on Bioethics. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and we are fortunate to have him here with us today. Welcome, Michael, and thank you for being here. Welcome back. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Giancarlo. Good to be back, especially in the company of these distinguished colleagues and friends. I think the discontent that afflicts democracy and has brought it to the brink has two sources. One is a widespread sense of disempowerment, sense among a great many people that their voices don't matter, that they don't have a meaningful say in shaping the forces that govern their lives. In the United States, in the run-up to this election, some 85% of Americans told survey takers they didn't think their voice mattered to those who govern. And the second source is a sense that the moral fabric of community is unraveling from family to neighborhood to the nation. And this connects with the point that Ivan made about the borders of political community and Seyla's observations about the anxious discourse about migration, about which I'd like to say something more in a moment. The populist backlash against elites and mainstream political parties and the election now for a second time of Donald Trump draws upon these sources of discontent, which have deepened and become more toxic in recent decades. To see the full measure of the source of the politics of grievance and anger and resentment, I think we have to look back at the last 5 decades when the divide between winners and losers has deepened, poisoning our politics and setting us apart. This divide has partly to do with the widening inequalities of income and wealth brought about by the market faith to which Seyla just referred, and more generally to the neoliberal project of globalization and financial deregulation and financialization of advanced economies. A project that was embraced, it's important to notice, not only by pro-business conservatives, but also by mainstream center-left parties. When Reagan and Thatcher arrived on the scene, they argued explicitly that government is the problem and markets are the solution. But when they were succeeded by center-left political parties, Bill Clinton in the United States, Tony Blair in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, they moderated, softened the harsh edges of the laissez-faire faith of Reagan and Thatcher, but they never challenged the fundamental premise of the market faith, never challenged the idea that markets and market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good. And so center-left as well as center-right mainstream parties presided over a neoliberal globalization project. But it wasn't only the economic inequality that resulted and that produced this deep source of anger and resentment. It was also during the kind of moral companion to neoliberalism, which had to do with meritocratic attitudes towards success. Those who landed on top during these 4 or 5 decades came to believe that their success was their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserved the full bounty that the market bestowed upon them, and by implication that those who struggled, those left behind, deserved their fate as well. And this is what's fed the toxic polarization that opened the way to the politics of grievance, to Donald Trump, who exploited it powerfully in the United States, and to similar right-wing authoritarian populist parties who managed to tap into this backlash in Europe, in Latin America, and elsewhere. Much was said in the run-up to this election in the United States about the gender gap. And there was a very wide gender gap in the vote for Donald Trump and for Kamala Harris. But wider even than the gender gap in this election was the education gap. The gap in voting patterns between those with and those without a university degree was even more pronounced than the divide in gender as between these two candidates. And that signifies well, that speaks to the meritocratic hubris that, and also the sense of humiliation for those without university degrees that emerged during this period of neoliberal globalization. By 2016 and continuing since, we've seen a great reversal, a great realignment in voting with regard to working people. By 2016, the Democratic Party had so alienated working people that they provided a powerful source of Donald Trump's victory in 2016, all the more so in 2024. It used to be that voters without university degrees voted for center-left parties, for the Democratic Party in the US, for the Labour Party in Britain, for the Socialists in France, for the Social Democrats in Germany. And now, in all of these places, it's reversed. The center-left parties have become parties more attuned to the values and the interests and the outlook of the professional classes, the credentialed classes, the well-educated classes, and have alienated working people who vote for Donald Trump in the United States, and in large numbers who vote for populist authoritarian right-wing parties in Europe. And so part of the challenge looking to the future, it seems to me, is to recognize that what opened the way to this right-wing populist backlash that casts a shadow over democracy was the combination of the neoliberal globalization / financialization project embraced by center-left parties and the credentialist prejudice, the meritocratic attitude toward winners and losers that they also embraced. They, I mean center-left parties. And so what's required to address the crisis that this dispensation has produced is first to move away and to acknowledge the failure of the neoliberal globalization project, and to try instead to find, to articulate and to develop a moral and political economy of citizenship, a project of democratic renewal that takes citizenship seriously, which goes to a point that both Ivan and Seyla mentioned. And this won't be easy, because on the one hand, it requires that the center-left parties articulate a left populist economic project of the kind that Bernie Sanders, for example, in the United States offer, but that they combine it with a politics, a center-left version or a social democratic version of a politics of patriotism and solidarity. The center-left has been allergic to patriotism, associating it with the xenophobia of the right-wing hyper-nationalists. But this seems to me a mistake. Any project for democratic renewal has to take seriously the meaning of citizenship, membership, belonging, solidarity, and that includes taking borders seriously with regard to the flow of goods, hence the mistake of the NAFTA-like free trade mania of those years, the flow of capital, because part of the neoliberal project was the unfettered flow of capital across national borders, and people, which brings us to the question, as Seyla referred to it, as the anxious discourse about migration, trying to make sense of that. Not by replicating, I'm not suggesting, in the name of patriotism and solidarity, that the center left replicate the xenophobia and the hypernationalism. But patriotism is too potent a moral and civic aspiration to cede to the hypernationalist right. And so this requires a project that is both more radical economically, or more populist, perhaps better, economically, and yet at the same time addresses the cultural sources of anxiety felt by people who may not know any immigrants, who may not live near the border, but who nonetheless see a nation that is not in control of its borders or its immigration policy as a nation unable to control its destiny, one that doesn't really take seriously the distinction between citizens and strangers.
Thank you very much, Michael, for these remarks and for offering the fourth of our opening gambits. I would like to give panelists the opportunity to respond in a very limited fashion for really just up to 2 minutes. If any panelists would like to do so, please raise your actual hand and I will make a note of it. For other audience members, please use what we call these days the raise hand function so we can take your questions. I know we have a number of audience members in Rome in particular, but really we welcome all of your comments. So Sophia, please let us know as these come in. So if any panelists desire to reply to any of the others, I'd be happy to call on you. Seyla, I see your hand, and James. So why don't we take James first, and then Seyla in the order of speaking. Thank you. Just 2 minutes, please. James, we just need to unmute you.
There we go. I'd like to address a question to Michael. I couldn't agree more with the strategies that you've laid out. However, part of what happened between the 1970s and the present is that the institutional base of center-left and left parties, the Democratic Party in particular, in the United States shifted from labor unions and the working class to universities. And parties, by their very nature, defend the class interests. They may do other things, but among the things they do is defend the class interests of their constituencies. And so I don't see how, while I'm sure there are many discussions taking place within the Democratic Party leadership right now about shifting rhetorical strategies and trying to position, at the end of the day, you still have a party that articulates and defends its own interests, and those don't change quickly. It's not as though the Republican Party does it any differently. I think that in the case of Donald Trump, who is in some respects sui generis, nevertheless, the cultural conditions that brought him about have been in place for a long time. And among evangelicals, for example, who understood they were being, that they were culturally alienated, after 2008, they found that they were economically alienated as well. And part of Trump's genius was to understand those resentments and them with almost insolent ease. So the question is, how does a center-left and left party transform itself in ways that are authentic, to speak to a kind of post-neoliberal economic order and a larger public culture that that undermines or at least challenges its own meritocratic justifications.
Thank you, James. Michael, would you like to take a couple of minutes to reply?
Sure. Well, thank you, James. It's a really important question. I think it's true that the Democratic Party is associated now less with the working class than with universities. And I think one of the reasons for this is connected to the moral and political economy, and therefore the political rhetoric that the Democratic Party has embraced in recent decades. By embracing the neoliberal market faith in conjunction with meritocratic attitudes towards success, the response, center-left parties are traditionally and are supposed to be addressing inequalities. And so the response to inequality produced by the neoliberal globalization that the Democratic Party offered, and it was true also of the Labour Party in Britain and other socialist parties, was to say, if you're struggling with wage stagnation and the outsourcing of jobs to low-wage countries, the solution is for you to go get a university degree. Because if you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to college. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. These were the mantras of the Democratic Party for decades. So the offer, the political project was, the response to inequality is individual upward mobility through higher education. That was the message. That was the response to inequality. And so that conferred enormous emphasis and prestige on universities as higher education, because that they are the institutions that define the merit and dispense the credentials that a meritocratic society honors and rewards. What I suggest is moving away from that moral and political economy and that political rhetoric to talk less about as if individual mobility through higher education were an adequate answer to inequality, and to deal more directly with structural sources of inequality, and rhetorically and morally to focus less on individual mobility and more on the dignity of work, to honor and reward and accord social esteem to the work people do, even who may lack a university degree. It's easy for us, and for that matter, for Democratic Party elites, to remember the simple fact that most Americans do not have a four-year degree. Nearly two-thirds do not. So it's folly to create an economy and a political project that makes as a necessary condition of dignified work and a decent life a university degree that most people don't have. And the figures in Europe are similar. About two-thirds to 70% in the case of Britain do not have a university degree. So it's a mistake to build this whole structure and political project as if in a way that aligns the interests of center-left parties with universities rather than working people, James, just as you suggest. And I want to give way to others, but we'll perhaps come back to the question of evangelicals and the matter of faith. I think the Democratic Party should be more faith-friendly, but that's another aspect of this kind of democratic renewal that I think center-left parties have to undertake.
Thank you, Michael. I think you're pointing out how hard it is to unravel the cultural from the economic and how
Exactly.
become.
Yeah.
But
And I think it's a mistake for us to distinguish too sharply between the economic and the cultural, precisely because they're intertwined and mutually reinforcing.
Let me give the floor now to Seyla Benhabib, please.
I will push back at this point in the argument. I'm neither happy with the evocation of the language of patriotism without more clear definition of what it would involve, nor am I happy with a defense of the so-called border. Let me make a point about the political economy of migration, and then I'll say something about cosmopolitanism in this context. The United States has been an incredibly lucky country because it has profited from the reserve army of the global unemployed. I think maybe the first thing that American citizens should acknowledge honestly is the degree to which the global workforce has contributed to the wealth of this country. It has always been the case. It continues to be the case. There are apparently 22 million migrants in the US workforce. 8.3 million are quote unquote undocumented, okay? This has something to do with also with the weakness of the American unions, and that it has not built, the American unions have not built a culture of integrating the migrant force. And so I cannot imagine a progressive politics that simply accepts this boundary between the inside and the outside without challenging the question of also the political economy of this kind of capitalism. I think they are related, so this is something for us to think about, because in Bernie Sanders' campaign, again and again, for me, the blind spot was the inability to link the inside and the outside. We have to do that. The second point is this: what are the constituents of patriotism? And how will this be possible? Michael, you and I think we've talked for as long as we've known each other about these questions. You know me, and I remember now the ghost of Judas Sklar, you know, our colleague who thought that, you know, all this could only lead to sort of a kind of right-wing revival. She was not long, but I want to say, maybe instead of patriotism, we want to talk about narratives of peoplehood. What constitutes a people? In the case of the United States, you cannot tell the story without challenging the fact that the American exceptionalism is the fact that it lives with borderlands, not with borders, but with borderlands. Okay, I think I will stop there. I like the concept of narratives of peoplehood. I think it can be applied to many countries besides the United States and European nations. Turkey have a need to redefine themselves through progressive narratives that take the best but do not exclude always, that are not always based upon the hatred, the othering, or the exclusion of those who do not belong to the mainstream narrative.
Thank you, Seyla. Before allowing Michael to reply to some of those points, I'd like to bring in Ivan to the conversation, since I know you had something to add.
I wanted to make just two brief points, and one goes to something that Seyla said in the beginning, and she said there are not many migrants, but there is a lot of movement. And I do believe this is quite important, because what is also changing is the political imagination of societies. Of course, there are not many migrants, but there are a lot of tourists. And people normally like them, but suddenly also people know how easily a tourist can become a migrant. And this kind of easiness and fastness of change, in my view, is critically important. And it goes also to the way the idea of the citizenship was kind of redefined. I don't know, have you seen this ranking of the best passports in the world? Normally, before the best citizenship, the best passports was the place where you live and your rights are best defended. So in a certain way, traditionally, in the beginning of 20th century, the most important about the American passport was that when you get an American passport, you don't need to run anywhere else anymore. So in a certain way, you can stop running. So now the best passports are defined of how easily you can move to other places. In a certain way, the idea of the citizenship is that how easy you can leave the country and how many other countries you can go. And in my view, this is very important. And this kind of easiness with which the change is happening scares people. It is not simply that basically you can change your sex here and there. Why it's so easy? And I'm saying this because there is one thing on which, in my view, basically the left never has a kind of a sensibility, was that the other major change that is happening is, let's put it very bluntly, we have seen a moment in which we can talk about the immortality of individual, but also we see the mortality of nations. No kids, not by accident that this idea of society is an intergenerational project, which is changing the way. And then you go to Silicon Valley and people said, I can live forever. All these things that basically have been our arms against the mortality of the individual, your community, your children, the books that you're reading, the fact that you're ready to die for your society and so on, suddenly they're becoming highly problematic. And I'm saying this because political community really is not simply people around. There are certain legacies, there are certain projects about the future. And I'm saying this, and I'm going to end up on this, because this very important easiness with which the things are changing, and the fact that the future stopped to be a project and become a collection of projections, be economic projections, be demographic projections, is changing this very idea of what community is. And this is why the governments and they start panicking. And this is why the people basically, they also feel kind of very much disempowered, because suddenly you have the feeling that you're very much on your own and your vote does not mean much.
Thank you, Ivan. This is a very fascinating set of interventions, and I wonder if we, I'd like the panel's views on to what extent we are overlooking any positive indicators. Is there any reason for optimism? I mean, we have evoked the reality that in many ways our society is experiencing some of the pressures that it did 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And yet our societies look different, right? The kind of mobility that Ivan was just talking about reflects a kind of material comfort that is new, that is more newly widespread. And the disempowerment certainly isn't new when we're speaking about most people, but what is new is that most people can vote now, right? And is there something intrinsically good about that, about democratic participation? And related to that, is there any good news to take away from the recent US presidential victory, in the sense that it was not an ethno-national coalition, that there were exceptions to that logic? There were many coveted electorates, Black men, Hispanics, whom you would not normally count within an ethno-national coalition. And so I'm curious about, what are the grounds for optimism, and what do we have to be grateful for beyond the reasons for worry?
Can I make a joke? If you want to be an optimist, you don't need to have grounds for optimism. Just be optimistic.
Jonathan, may I say something? I would say, I think that you having your intervention have something in common, which is the denounce of the lack of resources. Because all your intervention, beginning with James, have said that democracy has preconditions. We are losing ground on this field. The precondition of democracy. You can say it in a European way, like Habermas would say, or Buckenfurter would say, the liberal state, with the individualization of life, is consuming resources, but it's living on premises that it cannot reproduce, because if it tried to do that, that would contradict this liberal nature, would become ethical state, so authoritarian. But anyhow, the resources have been consumed, have been reduced during decades. The same, Seyla said that there is no more the force to socialize, to integrate immigrants. It's a lack of resources in this case, and also Michael, this empowerment, the loss of community, the loss of the grounds of solidarity. So the question that is coming now is, even Ivan said, what about the future? What about the lack of projections to the future? Also, another thing that needs to push the outlook of politics toward the future of society needs resources. So the big question, we are describing a shrinking of resources that are necessary to support democracy. There is one of the audience has written a question, have a look at that politics is becoming marketing of hate. Even Michael said that the divide between winner and loser is creating a resentment which is becoming toxic. So we are now describing this process of decadence, and the questions come to my mind: where can we find new resources for rejuvenate democracy? Or someone else is suggesting in the audience, we should be satisfied of a minimal negative definition of democracy, like something, the less evil. What is the regime that's producing less damages to the society? Which is a very negative, but it's not, I think, it's a useful way to look at democracy as a procedure, as a way to protect ourselves from the excesses of authority, but it's not the cure for our problem, the lack of resources.
Thank you, John.
What's your answer to this?
Let me just give a chance to Michael to reply, since I know he has to leave quite promptly, and then we'll just give a minute or two to each of you as a final word before we have a conclusion. Michael, please go ahead.
On the shrinking of sources for democratic renewal, Giancarlo, I assume you mean not just financial and economic resources, but also moral and social and civic resources. And I think one of the ways we can seek to reimagine and reconstitute sources for civic renewal, it's connected to our earlier discussion about patriotism, commonality, solidarity. I think it's to try to reconstruct the civic infrastructure for shared citizenship. This is not primarily a matter of borders. It's a matter of public places and common spaces. One of the most corrosive effects of the widening economic inequality of recent decades has been the erosion of public places and common spaces that bring us together in the course of our everyday lives. Democracy, and here I'm thinking about, well, public schools to begin with, but also public cultural and social institutions, from public parks and recreation centers to municipal centers to public transportation and health clinics to public libraries, that even for that matter, sports stadia. Among the moral and civic resources necessary to a sense of shared citizenship are occasions when people encounter one another in the course of their everyday lives. So democracy does not require perfect equality, but what it does require is that in the course of our everyday lives, we encounter one another and bump up against one another, because this is how we learn to abide our differences, to negotiate our differences. And this is how we come to care for the common good. It's what recalls us, these ordinary encounters and incidents in public places and everyday lives, whether it's a public swimming pool or whether it's a public school or whether it's sitting together in the bleachers at a sports stadium rooting for the local team. So I think that's part of what we could do to begin to try to reconstitute the ground, the resources for a shared public life.
Thank you, Michael, and being here. That leads very naturally into James. Please take the mic.
Just a quick, am I still on? No, there we go. Yeah. Again, Mo and I agree here, but it seems to me even prior to this is the recollection that before anything else, democracy was an ethical vision for the reconstitution of public life in ways that would extend and expand a vision of freedom and equality and justice and toleration. It was an ethical vision. Politics was not that vision. Democratic practices and rituals and institutions were not those, was not that vision, but it served that vision. And part of the problem is that we no longer, seems to me, have the ethical imagination to for a reconstituted public life and political life in a post-Enlightenment environment. And I think a central part of the problem is our leadership class, not just politicians and policymakers, but a leadership class across the dominant institutions, which Michael rightly points out are oriented by the cultural logics of a neoliberalism, which is to say, I've got mine, it's up to you to get yours.
Thank you, James. Let me just jump now to Seyla for your final 2 minutes.
I am waiting the first 100 days of this administration. I am not quite convinced that there will be a tremendous capacity for resistance and regeneration, although we all have to do our best. And in my case, it will be getting more involved with refugee work. But if, in fact, the midterm elections proceed as they should, there is a good chance that the House can come back to the control of the Democrats. I know James warned us not to talk about just the surface politics, and we cut deeper and deeper into certain issues. But there is an immediacy to what is going on in the political institutions, in the sense that the three branches of government plus the US Supreme Court some elements seem to be caught in the midst of a conservative revolution. So we just need to see what happens in the first 100 days, and then what happens if we will have midterm elections. That's too short term. I'm worried about this. I cannot deny it. The second thing that I am very worried about is the attack on public media, civil society, and the NGOs. It's all well and good to talk about solidarity, colleagues, and I join you. But one of the first things that this DOGE program is talking about is cutting the budget of the Public Broadcasting Corporation. Okay? So we will be deprived of public radio and television stations, possibly in many parts of the country. Second, NGOs, where, everything from HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society onwards, will have their budgets slashed in some ways. So I don't see any good news in the short term. We have to, as educators, engage in the work of public enlightenment, the best way in which we can, and help in our communities in the best way in which we can. But we have to be very attentive to the really serious transformations that this country is undergoing, in my opinion.
Thank you, Seyla. And Ivan, would you like a final word? Just 1 to 2 minutes.
Yeah, just a few sentences. Listen, it's very important what is in crisis. And in my view, the crisis is the very idea of reformism. That through democratic process, you can slowly and carefully change societies. If you see what is radical, for example, in the political thinking of somebody like Elon Musk and some of other the Silicon Valley kind of utopians, that is, we should start from the beginning. We should start in another place, and in a certain way, we should start with another people. And I do believe that this kind of a movement of the idea of the revolution from this world to another world is something that is also critically important, because democracy is very much connected to the idea of reformism. And if there is an idea in crisis, in my view, this is the idea of reformism.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and thank you all for your interventions. I want to note that today's discussion is just a first installment on Reset Dialogue's engagement on these topics. We will be holding a meeting in person in Rome at the end of January, on the 30th, 31st, and 1st of February, with the title Liberal Democracy Revisited, Ideas for New Political Leadership, Taking Seriously the Needs and Fears of the Many. So it is in many ways quite an apt follow-up to this conversation. I'd like to recognize for that forthcoming conference the support of the Hoge Family Fund and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and the ongoing support of the Nomis Foundation for all of our activities. I encourage everyone to check out our website to sign up for our newsletter and get in touch regarding opportunities to contribute to these efforts, including our end of May seminars in Venice. Giancarlo, would you like to have a final word?
Thank you, Jonathan. Just to thank you for conducting so well our discussion. And thank you to all of you.
Thanks, everyone. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Mhm.